What's up, Python nerds? Quick warning, today's going to be a bit of a dry video, and it's because today we're simply just discussing a new data type, lists. So I'll talk about what lists are, how we build them, how we manipulate them, and I'll work through several methods for modifying our lists. All right, so let's start off by defining what a list is. A list is very similar to a variable, except it's storing a collection of objects. And these objects can be virtually anything, right? So we designate a list. I'll just call this my list. We start off by defining it just like we would with a variable, right? We've got the equal sign showing what the data is on the right, being stored in the list name on the left. And our list is designated with square brackets, right? And the items that are within our list are separated by commas, right? So I can have a list of numbers like 1, 2, and 3, right? And if I want to see what's inside of my list, I call on it just like I would call on a variable, and I see that I've got the numbers 1, 2, 3 inside of my list. So here are a few examples of lists, right? Here we can see that we have an empty list. We've got a square brackets with nothing inside. That might seem a little strange to you right now, but believe it or not, we do this quite often. It's called initializing a list. We create a list that we know we will fill later, and we do that at the beginning of our program, and later in our program we collect data and we store it inside that empty list, right? Lists can have strings, right? So here is a list of cities, and you can start guessing why I chose those 5 cities if you like. Here is a list of years, right? So lists can also include integers, right? So we have 5 integers inside of our years list. Lists can also include floats. So here we have a list of what I'm calling magnitudes, right? We have 5 data points in there. All of those are floating point data points. Lists can include a mix of data types, right? So here I have a list simply just called mixed, and I have a string inside of it, an integer, and a float. And then finally, a list can include other lists, right? So here I'm calling this list city data, and inside my list I have 1, 2, 3 lists, right? And here's a point where you can kind of see how lists can be used in a data science context, right? So here, my first list within my city data list contains information about the city Tangshan, right? The second list contains information about the city Banda Aceh, right? So you can think about how this can represent an entire spreadsheet, right? Where I have rows of data, right? Each list here could be a row, and then the items in order could be thought of as my columns. So column 1 are my cities, column 2 are my years, column 3 are my floating point data, my magnitudes. So as I've mentioned in other videos, one of the things that I hated when I was learning Python for the first time, or really any tool, was learning a lot of random techniques and not understanding why I was learning them. And today's video, where I'm going over lists, you'll see me covering a ton of techniques, and it would make for a very long video if I continuously showed how this might be useful down the road in several other contexts, right? So I want to start off this video by jumping ahead a bit and showing how lists could be used in a more advanced way than you're currently capable of using them, right? So I want to talk about earthquakes, or earthquake if you're my son, or Tyler the Creator. So the USGS, which stands for United States Geological something, has a program where they publish real-time earthquake data as it comes in. But this is how it looks like when it comes in, right? This is today's data, and you can see this is just a giant mess, right? The USGS is not doing us any favors, right? But these are the earthquakes of the day, right? So let's say I wanted to take a look at this data and make some sort of sense out of it, right? Well, here's a relatively simple program where I can do that. It is, though, drawing on techniques that we haven't covered yet, right? So we are importing a few libraries, right, which I will talk about in a few videos. We are connecting to this website. This is the exact same URL, right? We are connecting to this website. We are pulling the data from that website and storing it as an object. We are creating a data set out of this. Then you can see we are defining a few lists, right? Recognize my empty list here and here. We are running a loop, which I'm going to cover in my very next video, through that, and we're pulling the information that we want. Essentially what this program is doing is it's sorting through all this mess, and it's just digging out the actual data points that we find interesting, right? And we're storing it. So let me just run this real quick. And when I did this, I created a sorted data set, which is sorted by the magnitudes of these earthquakes, and then a variable of the top 5 biggest magnitudes of the past 24 hours or so. So let's take a look at both of these. So let's look at sorted rows. And here's our data, right? And it's sorted from the largest earthquake of the day to the smallest. And let's just quickly look at the top 5. And we can see that we have 5 earthquakes of the day with a magnitude over 5. One of them in the Fiji region, 2 of them in Russia, and 1 in Chile, and 1 in Tonga. So right away you can see already that we have nested lists. I have a list of lists here, right? And you can see how that can be used as a data set. In fact, it'd be very easy for me to save this to a spreadsheet like Microsoft Excel or a CSV file. All right, so that is my best attempt at showcasing how a list could be useful. Grabbing data from an external database and storing the data that we want, filtering through that data and pulling out the information that we want and storing them in either a list or a set of lists that we can later convert to a spreadsheet, something that's a bit easier to analyze. So I'm now going to cover some of the features that we need to keep in mind as we use lists in our programs. There are more to lists than what I'm going to cover in this video, but this is plenty enough for a beginner as our example. So let's see what we have in here. We have 5 cities, all strings, of course. And the first thing I want to go over is the fact that these lists are ordered, meaning that Tangshan is the first item in this list. It's not just a random set of cities. They are ordered from first to last, and the ordering actually matters, right? So the first concept we need to go over is what we call indexing our list, which means accessing the items within the list based on their order, right? So to index from a list, to pull an item based on its placement in that order, we simply use the list name and then put square brackets juxtaposed right next to the list, and then we put the order number within those square brackets. However, something that we need to keep in mind is that in Python, unlike in other program languages, the ordering is 0 based, which means the first item in our list is called the 0th item. It's location 0, index 0, right? So if I want to pull Tangshan from my list, I need to put in the location 0. It is the first item, right? And we see that the first city in our list is Tangshan. So if Tangshan is the 0th item in our list, then the last item, Valdivia, is going to be index 4, right? Because we've got index 0, Tangshan, index 1 is Banda Aceh, index 2 is Port-au-Prince, index 3 is Sandai, and index 4 is Valdivia. So let's just go ahead and verify that. We've got cities, and we want to pull that 5th item, index 4, which will be Valdivia, right? Another way to guarantee, see, this was an effective way for me to pull the last item from my list, but it requires that I know that there are 5 items, right? Sometimes we want to pull the last item from the list and we don't want to have to know or hard code in the number of items that we have. So what we can do is use negative indexing. The index -1 is the last item in our list, right? So we can just verify that, and we see that Valdivia is in fact our last item, and this works its way forward. So I can do -2 is Sandai, and let me just do a few more. Let's go ahead and do -4, and that's Banda Aceh, -1, -2, -3, and -4. So we can index either forward or backwards. So if we make a mistake, if we try to index outside of our range, right? So right now we have a range of 5. We've got our cities 0 through 4. So if I try to call on index number 5, I'm going to get an index error. And we can see that right here. If I forget that Python, it has 0-based indexing, and I ask for index number 5, which is actually the 6th item, I'm going to get this fun little error that says the list index is out of range. Right, so let's get rid of that ugly error and pretend like it never happened. So another important characteristic about lists is that they're mutable, which simply just means that we can change them, right? I have my list of cities right now, but I can add cities, I can remove cities, I can change the contents of this list. There are other data types such as tuples, which we'll get to in another video, where you can't make these modifications, right? And I'll go over how to make these modifications later in this video. So let's talk about nested indexing, right? So we have a list called city data. Let's remind ourselves what's in this list. And we see that we have a list of 3 lists, right? So before I talked about how we access the first item of the list would be to simply put in the 0. So let's just see what's inside item 0, our first item. And we see we have an entire list. What if I wanted to pull an item from within that list, from within that inner list, right? Well, the same rules apply, essentially. If I want the first item of the first list, I'm just going to push these 2 indexes right next to each other. So I want list 0, meaning list 1, and I want item 0, meaning item 1. And this gives us Tangshan, right? Because it is our first list, right? 0, our first list, and the first item within that list, right? So this syntax might look a little strange to you, but you'll get used to it as we start calling on these objects and making modifications to them in our code, right? So if I want, let's say the second, let's go with our second year, right? Well, let's go with our second magnitude so that we don't keep duplicating this. Well, to get the second list, right, I'm going to put in 1, and to get the last item within that list, I can do -1, right? And that will get us our second city data, right? Second list is Banda Aceh, and the last item is our magnitude. If I happen to know that, then I can use this -1 to always pull from my magnitudes, right? All right, we'll work through one more example. Let's do our last city, right? And let's get the year. So that should be the second item, right? And we have 2010. Last city, I used -1 to designate that I want the last item in my list of city data, right? Which would be this last list. And then I used 1, I want the second item, not the 0 item, but the 1 item, the 1 index, right, from that last list, and that is 2010. So this is what we call nested indexing. It only comes up if we have a list that contains other lists within it. Now, a big topic when it comes to lists is what we call slicing our lists. To slice a list, it means exactly what it sounds like. We are slicing off a chunk of that list. Usually we're taking that chunk and storing it in a new object, maybe a new list, right? So there are a few rules when it comes to slicing that can get a bit confusing when you're starting off, right? So when we take a slice of a list, we have to say where we're starting that slice and where we're ending that slice. So there's 2 arguments we need to put in: the beginning of our new list and the end of our new list, right? So let's look at our list of cities real quick. And let's say we wanted just the first 2 cities. We wanted to take the first 2 cities and store it in a new list, right? Well, we would need to tell Python, start with the first item and end with the second item, right? Sounds simple enough. The confusing part is when we pass in those 2 arguments, starting with the first item, index 0, and ending with the second item, index 1. Python interprets our first argument as inclusive. So when I say index 0 as our starting point, it will include index 0, it will include Tangshan. But it's exclusive of our second argument, which means if I were to put 1, meaning Banda Aceh, as my ending point, it wouldn't include Banda Aceh in my new list. So my list would only have Tangshan. I'll show you what I mean. So this is how we slice, right? We will do cities. And let's store this in a variable. I'll call it first 2 and cities. And we're going to start with Tangshan. So we're starting with 0. And then we put in this colon to say, give me a slice, start with 0. And then after the colon, we are going to put where we're ending. But again, we need to go 1 past where we're ending because Python is exclusive of the ending point. Very confusing, right? So we don't want to put in 1 here because it would include Tangshan, but it would exclude Banda Aceh, right? So we need to put in 2, right? Give me Tangshan, give me Banda Aceh, and before, but don't include Port-au-Prince, right? So let's see. Oh, I called this FIS2. Let's call it first 2. All right, so first 2, let's see if this worked. And we see that we've got our 2 cities, Tangshan, Banda Aceh, right? So it started with Tangshan, it went up to, but not including Port-au-Prince. So let's go over a few more examples of these slices. Give myself some space here. Okay, so let's say if I wanted the middle 3, which means I don't want Tangshan and I don't want Valdivia, right? So I'm creating a list. I will call this list middle 3, and I am slicing from cities, right? I'm slicing from cities, and I'm putting the starting point inclusive of the starting point. So give me Banda Aceh, that's my starting point, index 1, not 0, but 1, and go all the way through, but not including index 4, right? Remember, Valdivia is index 4, so it's going to give me 1, 2, 3, up to, but not including 4. So this should be my middle 3. And we see that it is. All right, so a slice, as you can see, is pretty simple, right? It looks like we're indexing, except we have this colon. On the left-hand side is the starting point of our slice. On the right-hand side is the ending point of our slice. One little shortcut, because slicing, believe it or not, is something we will do a lot. In fact, in the example that I did before with the top 5, with our use case, you could see that I did a little slice. But one interesting thing that you might notice is I didn't put a beginning. I only put an end, right? And that's because a shortcut in Python, when you're slicing, is if you leave one of these arguments out, it will just go to the extreme point in that direction. Meaning if I leave out the starting point, it's just going to start with the first item. If I leave out the ending point, it's just going to go all the way to the last item. Right? So let's take a look at that. So let's do the first 2 again, which we had already done before. Right? And you see the syntax that we used the last time. I'm going to replicate it with 1 change. I will not put the starting point. I will just put the ending point. And we should get the same result. And we do. Right? Now if I want the last 2, it's going to look pretty similar. Right? We put the starting point. Remember, it's inclusive of the starting point. So 0, 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to put 3, and I won't put an argument for the ending point. And this should work. And we get our last 2 cities. All right, so that's pretty much it for slicing our lists. Now what I will start to go over are what we call our methods, right? So a method is a lot like a function, except it's tied to a specific data type, right? So you know that you're using a method when you see dot notation with parentheses following some data type. So I'll show you what I mean. So let's go ahead and take a look at our list again. I will give us a little bit of room. So we have our list of cities here. Now, if I wanted to add a city to this list, let's say I wanted to add Chicago to this list. Well, we'll call on my cities, and now I'm going to use this dot notation, dot, and I'm going to put the name of my method, which is just a function that's used only for lists, right, in this case. And I will use the append method. And then inside the parentheses, I pass in my argument or my arguments. And my argument here is what I'm appending, right? So I'm adding Chicago to the end of my list. That's called appending the list with Chicago. And here we go. And we can see it worked. Now my list has 6 items in it. The 0th item being Tangshan, the last item being Chicago. Now, if I wanted to put a city in a specific part of my list, let's say I wanted to put a city as the 3rd item in the list. So not 0, not 1, but item 2, right? Index 2, right? So I can use the method called insert. So insert, and let's put in Boston. The first argument is where I'm putting it. So the 3rd item is item 2, right? 0, 1, 2. We want Boston to show up right there. And then we separate arguments inside of functions and methods with commas. So my 2nd argument is going to be what I'm putting in. And I am putting in Boston. Let's see if this worked. And now you can see my list now has 7 items in it: Tangshan, Banda Aceh, Boston, Port-au-Prince, Sendai, Valdivia, and Chicago. So it's becoming a pretty eclectic list of cities here. So let's say I wanted to extend my list with another list, right? So if I wanted to take my list of 7 cities and I had some other list of cities, and I wanted to basically take the other list and just add it right to the end of my current list, right? So first I need that 2nd list. Let's go ahead and create it. I will call it new cities. And let's put in some underrepresented, underrated American cities in here. So let's do New Orleans. Let's do Memphis. Let's do Atlanta. Let's give some love to our southern cities, right? So I've got new cities here. I just ran this, so I've stored the data. Let's just make sure it's in there. There's our 3 new cities. And now I want to extend my primary list of cities, called cities, with this set of new cities, right? So I need to use a method called extend, cities.extend, and simply pass in one argument, new cities, right? And we can see right here that it added our 3 southern cities to the end of our list, right? So now our list has about 10 cities. I've kind of lost count. All right, so all of these methods have added new items to our list. We can add them to the end, we can insert them in a specific index, or we can take 2 lists and merge them into one long list. But sometimes we want to remove items from our list. Maybe we are working through a list of data, and as we work through the list, we want to go ahead and remove the items as we go. So there's a few ways to do this. We can just simply manually remove an item, right? So let's go ahead and remove one of these cities. I'm going to remove Banda Aceh, so I don't have to pronounce it anymore. And let's just check and see if it worked. And we can see Banda Aceh no longer exists in our list. And one thing to keep in mind with all of these methods, these are in-place changes, which means the second I run this line of code, I have overwritten the memory store for my list called cities with this new version that doesn't include Banda Aceh. Now, another way that we remove items from a list is by using what's called the pop method. The pop method will remove the last item in a list, but it will also return that item to you. It's like taking it out of the list and giving it to you. Right now, anytime somebody says that Python is returning something, it means when you run that line of code, if you were to store that line of code in a variable, whatever's being returned will now exist in that variable. Right? Sometimes we run a line of code and it returns nothing. Right? So you'll get an error if you try to store that line of code inside a variable because nothing was returned, nothing was given to you. So there's no data to store. Right? But when we use the pop method, right, we are removing the last item from our list, and Python's taking it out of your list and trying to hand it to you. Right now, you don't have to take it. You could just let it go. But if you decide to take it, just store it in a variable. Now you're holding on to it. It's like it's a little basket to put it in. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's go ahead and pop the last city, which is the default behavior for the pop method. So I will store it inside of a variable that I will just call last, cities.pop, right? And I'm not going to pass any argument inside of pop because by default, the default argument is -1, the last item, right? And now let's see. So you can see that the variable last now houses Atlanta, right? And if we look at what's inside of our cities list now, we can see Atlanta's gone. So Atlanta was taken out of our cities list and put inside of this variable called last. Now, this is something that we will use quite a bit. Like if you had a list of cities and for each city you needed to perform some sort of task, right? You could think of your list as almost like a to-do list. And once you've performed that task on your last city, you're like crossing it off of your to-do list. You're popping it. You're taking it out. I'm done with Atlanta. Whatever data analysis I need to do for Atlanta has been done. I need it out of my list, right? We can pass in an argument to the pop method. And let's say we wanted to pop from the beginning of our list, right? Well, I would just put in 0 as my argument. And let's see, and Tangshan has now been popped out of our list. It's now stored in my variable called first, and my cities no longer has Tangshan in it. So my list of cities is getting shorter. So another very common method that we use with lists is sorting our lists, right? And by default, Python will sort lists in using a behavior that's completely predictable. It will either sort strings based on alphabetical order. It will sort numbers from in ascending order from smallest to largest, right? So let's just take a look at this. We can sort our cities using the sort method. We've got our dot notation. I'm going to use the default argumentation, meaning I want it to sort by alphabetical order, so I'm not passing in any argument. And I can now see that this was sorted in place. So now my list of cities has been overwritten with this alphabetized version, right? Now let's go ahead and create a list of numbers so that we can see how this works with numbers. Right? And I'm going to just quickly, just to expose you to some things that are coming up later in this series. Let's just go ahead and import a library, right? Because it's been a pretty boring video. So let's import the library random. This allows us to do exactly what you might think, generate random data. So let's import a library called random, and let's create a list of numbers. I'll call my list numbers. And inside my list of numbers, I am going to random sample, right? Random sample from a range of 1 to 101, right? Because it doesn't include the last item. So from 1 to 101, and let's stick with 5. Give me 5 items here, 5 numbers between 1 and 100, and let's see what these numbers are. And we have the numbers 1, 53, 25, 93, and 55. So if I want to go ahead and sort my numbers, right, I could see they're now sorted from lowest to largest. In fact, I could have sorted that as I created the list of numbers if I wanted to. Now, if I ever want to sort my data in descending order, right, instead of from smallest to largest, I want to go from largest to smallest, then I do need to manually pass in an argument. The argument is going to be reverse equals true, right? So by default, the argument that's inside of sort is reverse equals false. So now we are reversing that to reverse equals true, reversing the reverse. And we can see that our data is now sorted in descending order. And we can do the same thing with cities. I'll just come up here and do reverse equals true. And now my cities are sorted in reverse alphabetical order. All right, so we're almost done. That is all the methods I'm going to go over. Let's talk about some functions, right? So a function is a lot like a method, but it's a bit more broadly applicable. They are not just tied to that specific data type. And oftentimes they don't manipulate your list in place. Usually what a function is going to do is return information about your list, but it's not going to necessarily change your list, right? So I'll just go over some of the more common functions that we should know about. First, if you ever need to know how long your list is, how many objects are inside of it, we can use the length function. And right now our list of cities has 10 cities. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And here's the moment where I realized that earlier when I extended my list, at some point, I'm not even sure when, let's see, at some point I extended it twice, right? So this is a good example of how you can make a mistake because you are overwriting your data in place, right? So I extended my list with my new cities 2 different times, right? But because it wasn't alphabetized before, I didn't notice. You guys are smarter than me. You probably noticed this at some point during the video. It was confusing. Hopefully I remember to make a little note in the video so that you're not confused for too long. But this is simply because I ran this cell 2 times. So I extended the list twice, right? All right, so I just exposed that error with that function, so I guess that's good. If I ever want to find the highest item, like the largest item in a list, usually that's going to be numbers. I can use the max function. So max of numbers, remember numbers is this list right here, should give me 93, and it does, right? We can also, as you might guess, do min. And our smallest item in that list of numbers is 1. You can find the sum of a list, right? So if I wanted to calculate the total of my list, I can do sum of numbers. And let's ask for total. And the sum of my list of numbers is 227. I'm not going to double check Python's math. I'm just going to trust it inherently. And finally, one thing that you can do that might look a little odd, but believe it or not, it's one of the most common functions that we'll use with lists, is we can enumerate our list, which means for every item in our list, we could create a list of lists that says the 0th item is 93, the first item is 55, and so forth, right? So I'll show you what that looks like. And then I'll briefly talk about why we might want to use that. And then in the next video, we'll go right to using this function. So let's go ahead and index our list, right? We're enumerating our list. So to do that, I'm going to store what's returned in a variable called indexed. I want to create a list. So I'm using this list function. I'm creating a list of what's being returned. I'm enumerating numbers, right? So essentially what this is doing is it's saying, hey, take my list of numbers right here, enumerate them, which means put them with their index 0, 93, 155, 253, and so forth, and then take what that enumerated version of numbers and turn it into a list and store that list inside of a variable called indexed. Right? So there's a lot going on with this one line of code. And let's see what's in there. So you can see we've got 0, 93, 155, and so forth, right? So these are tuples. I told you that we would discuss tuples at some point. We're not really going into any detail right now, but a tuple is a lot like a list, except it's not mutable. You can't change them, right? Now, the reason why you might want to do this, let's say you wanted to go through a list and perform some sort of action to every item in the list. And you need to keep track of where you were in the list as you were doing this. Well, what we would do is we would run what's called a loop. Specifically, we would run what's called a for loop, F-O-R, for loop. And with a for loop, we would loop through each item in the list, and then we would perform whatever function or whatever set of code we wanted to perform on those items. So we would need them to be enumerated so we could tell Python, hey, do item 0, then do item 1, then do item 2, and so forth. Right? So we need access to two data points. We need access to the data, like for instance number 93, and we also need access to the index, for instance index 0. So that may seem a little abstract and hard to grasp right now, but in the very next video we're going to do that. We will write some for loops where we are looping through a list and performing some set of code, some functions, some manipulations to the data that's within the list. All right, so that's it for today's video. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.
Let's go. Yeah. I'm like an addict, do I gotta have it. I ain't even playing, got a really bad habit. If it moves, gotta grab it, fuse like a magnet. Lose, won't have it till I'm doomed in a casket. I ain't playing, got a weird mind. If you work 8 hours, I'ma work 9.